All right. Hey, everybody. Dan Fitzpatrick here at stockmarketmentor.com. Look, we had a really, really great training session this morning for members. I went into a lot of detail about SoFi, about the way the stock was trading. We actually went ahead and put this on the active trade list because of the characteristics of this sell-off here. We had, like on last Thursday, a big shakeout here. This was kind of a little bit heavier than average volume as far as this downdraft here. A really, really crappy closing location, like right at the bottom of the range at 4 o'clock. So, and I went into a lot more detail as far as the psychology and all that in our training session. But to put it simply, the only reason this stock stopped going down was because the closing bell rang. And so it was really no surprise if you really think about it. It'd be an unpleasant surprise if you were long, but it was no surprise that the stock gapped down further on Monday morning. But then ultimately we got a really, really nice move back up to the upside, which can also happen. And again, I'll say it one more time. I went into a lot more detail on this, probably about 15 minutes worth in the strategy or in the training session this morning. And so then because of this little 3-candle reversal here, we went ahead and put this on the list. And so I did a similar thing with Palantir. You can see some similar characteristics here. A really, really brutal closing location on Thursday, a gap down on Friday, and then a close up. It wasn't as dramatic as SoFi's here. This is what it looked like on Friday. Palantir just barely got above there, but the dynamics are really the same. But this is what I did. I'm actually working on my book, Trade Smart or Don't Trade at All. And I'm looking at measured moves. And something was really interesting to me that I wanted to pass along. You typically expect a move, like a breakout from a prior consolidation. You expect it to go about the same distance as this prior consolidation. In other words, so I'll put it this way. Let me get this out of the way. So like this was the top of what turns out to be a cup with a little handle, but this is the top of the cup. This is the bottom right here. It's about 47, 48 bucks or whatever. So if you were to say, all right, well, once the stock breaks above this level, then I want to go ahead and buy this stock because I think this measured move is going to take this up, we'll say 47 bucks, right up to about 237. So we'll even take it back and say like 235, something like that. So this would be the measured move that I'm thinking about from this breakout here. Now, we did get the breakout, pulled back here. So we haven't hit this target yet. But now, and that doesn't mean we're not going to, or it doesn't mean that we are. It just kind of depends on the vagaries of the market, shall we say. But now I've got a different trading range here. The support right here is just along this line here. But I'm looking at this as a different pattern. It's almost kind of like a fractal, a pattern within a pattern. But if we look at this high here and this low here, now we've got about 37, 38 bucks. And so now if I extend from this high, assuming this stock breaks out above this level, and so if I get this kind of breakout, I'm looking at about a 38 buck move. What do we get? Right around 245-ish or so. So what is my measured move on this? My measured move is I'm looking at about a range. We'll go here. I'll lock this in. I'm looking at about a range like this. This is what I want to see. But I don't expect it to happen right away. We've already got earnings out of the way, so they're not an issue. But assuming the market just kind of continues to move higher, ultimately, this is what I'm looking at for Palantir. So this kind of frames my trade. I've got a measured move from here to here, and I've also got a measured move from here down to here. And this gives me a range that I can expect this stock to go if the stock trades like they typically do. Now, so what do? I've got this range here. Well, hey man, I think I'll shoot for 245. No, we don't get a vote. Instead, what I like to do is I like to be even more conservative. I'll say, all right, I think the stock can go to about 235. You know what? Let's just say maybe 230. If it can get to 230, will that be a good trade for me? And so as I look at that from here to here, I see about a 18, 19% move. I can keep a stop just a little bit below today's intraday low. That's about 5.5%. If this is my risk versus reward, yeah, that works for me. So guys, that's exactly what we're doing at Stock Market Mentor. Now, if you're not a member, why don't you fix that at $7, dude? Come on, $7. $7. All right, I'll see you there.